The old courthouse smelled like dust and disappointment. 17-year-old David sat in the wooden chair that creaked every time he moved. His legs barely reached the floor properly, making him feel even smaller than he already did in this big room full of adults who seemed angry at him. Judge Williams looked down from her high seat behind the massive desk. She had been doing this job for 23 years, and today felt like just another day dealing with kids who didn't want to follow the rules. The paperwork in front of her told a simple story. Another teenager skipping school. Another family that probably didn't care enough to make sure their child got an education. David kept his eyes down, staring at his worn-out sneakers. The left one had a small hole near the toe that he had tried to color over with a black marker. It didn't really work, but it was better than nothing. His grandmother had bought these shoes for him 6 months ago, and they were already falling apart. But there wasn't money for new ones right now. The public defender, Mr. Peterson, shuffled through his papers. He had 17 other cases that day, and hadn't spent much time learning about David's situation. All he knew was what the school had reported. The boy had missed 28 days of school in the past 2 months. That was a lot, even for kids who didn't like going to class. "David Thompson," Judge Williams called out, making the boy's head snap up for just a second before he looked down again. "You're here because Lincoln High School says you've been skipping classes." "A lot of classes." David nodded slightly but didn't say anything. His throat felt dry and his hands were shaking a little. He had never been in a courtroom before. The whole place felt scary, with its high ceiling and serious-looking people in suits. Even the security guard by the door looked like he was ready to grab David if he tried to run. His grandmother, Mrs. Thompson, sat in the back row. She was 74 years old and had raised David since he was 8. When his parents died in that terrible car accident on Highway 95, she worked 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night and watching Mrs. Rodriguez's baby during the day. She was tired all the time, but she loved David more than anything in the world. She wished she could speak up and explain things to the judge. Tell her about how smart David was, how he read books all the time and knew things that even adults didn't know. But she had learned over the years that sometimes it was better to stay quiet in situations like this. People in authority didn't always listen to old women like her. Judge Williams flipped through the file again. "It says here you're 17 years old. Most kids your age are thinking about graduation, maybe college, getting jobs, but you can't even be bothered to show up to school." David wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. He had always been quiet, especially around people he didn't know. When he was little, his mother used to call him her shy little genius. She would sit with him for hours while he read books that were meant for much older kids. She never made him feel bad about being different, but his mother wasn't here anymore, and this judge didn't look like she would understand. The judge noticed David's silence and took it the wrong way. In her experience, kids who wouldn't talk were usually the ones who didn't respect authority. They thought they were too cool to answer questions, too tough to care about consequences. "Are you going to sit there and say nothing?" she asked, her voice getting sharper. "This is serious, young man. Your future is on the line here." David finally looked up and met her eyes for about 2 seconds before looking away again. He was holding a small notebook in his hands, gripping it tightly like it was some kind of lifeline. The cover was worn and taped in a few places where it had started to fall apart. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client has been having some difficulties at home. His grandmother is his guardian, and she works multiple jobs to support them. Sometimes David has to help with household responsibilities." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. David did help his grandmother when she needed it. But that wasn't really why he had been missing school. The real reason was much more complicated, and Mr. Peterson didn't know about it because David had never told anyone. Judge Williams sighed and leaned back in her chair. She had heard stories like this before. Poor family, absent parents, overworked guardian, kid falling through the cracks. It was sad, but it was also common. And in her experience, making excuses didn't help these kids learn to take responsibility for their choices. "I understand that life can be hard," she said, looking directly at David even though he wasn't looking back at her. "But that doesn't mean you get to just give up on school. Education is the only way out of poverty. It's the only way to build a better life." David's grip on his notebook got even tighter. Inside that beaten-up composition book were things that would have amazed the judge if she had known about them. Pages and pages of mathematical equations that most college students couldn't solve. drawings of scientific concepts that he had learned about by reading advanced textbooks at the public library. Ideas for inventions that could actually work if someone gave him the chance to try them. But the judge couldn't see any of that. All she saw was a quiet kid who seemed like he didn't care about anything. The courtroom felt stuffy, and David could hear his grandmother shifting nervously in her seat behind him. He knew she was worried. She had already taken the morning off work to come here, which meant she would lose money they couldn't afford to lose. Judge Williams continued talking about responsibility and consequences and making better choices. David heard the words, but they felt like they were coming from very far away. He had heard similar speeches from teachers and principals and counselors. They all seemed to think that he was lazy or didn't care about learning. The truth was exactly the opposite. David cared about learning more than anything else in the world. It was just that regular school moved so slowly for him that it felt like torture to sit through classes where teachers spent entire weeks explaining things he had figured out in minutes. But how could he explain that without sounding like he thought he was better than everyone else? How could he tell adults that their system wasn't working for him without seeming disrespectful? So he stayed quiet, holding on to his notebook full of dreams and discoveries that no one knew about. Judge Williams had seen enough. This silent treatment from David was getting on her nerves, and she decided it was time to be more direct with him. In her mind, sometimes teenagers needed to hear hard truths to wake them up from their careless attitudes. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," she said firmly, her voice echoing off the courtroom walls. David slowly raised his head again, but his eyes kept darting away. The judge thought this was defiance, but really, David had always struggled with eye contact. It made him feel too exposed, like people could see right through him. "Do you think this is some kind of game?" Judge Williams continued, leaning forward in her chair. "Do you think you can just decide that school doesn't matter and there won't be any consequences?" David's heart was beating fast. He wanted to answer, wanted to explain that school did matter to him, but in a different way than she probably meant. His mouth felt dry and the words just wouldn't come out. This was always how it went when adults confronted him. His mind would go blank and he'd freeze up completely. The judge interpreted his continued silence as stubbornness. She had dealt with plenty of teenage boys who thought they were too tough to show respect in her courtroom. In her experience, they needed to understand that their actions had real consequences. "I see kids like you every single day," she said, her voice getting louder. "Young people who think the world owes them something, who don't want to put in any effort but expect everything to be handed to them." Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in the back row. She wanted desperately to stand up and defend her grandson, to tell the judge about all the nights she had found David reading by flashlight under his blankets because he didn't want to wake her up, about how he devoured every book in their small apartment and then walked 2 miles to the library to find more. But she had learned over her 74 years that sometimes speaking up in situations like this only made things worse, especially for people like them, who didn't have money for fancy lawyers or connections to important people. Judge Williams was just getting started. "At your age, I was working a part-time job after school and maintaining perfect attendance. I understood that education was my ticket to a better life. But I suppose that kind of dedication is foreign to kids today." David clutched his notebook tighter. Inside it were solutions to problems that had been puzzling him for weeks. Mathematical proofs that he had worked out by himself, late at night when the world was quiet and he could think clearly. Scientific theories that he had developed after reading research papers online at the library. But none of that mattered right now. Right now he was just another kid in trouble, being lectured by an adult who thought she understood his story. "You live with your grandmother," the judge continued, looking at her paperwork. "That woman is probably struggling to make ends meet, working hard to provide for you. And this is how you repay her? By throwing away the education she's probably sacrificing to give you?" That hit David hard. He looked quickly back toward his grandmother. And their eyes met for a moment. He could see the worry and sadness in her face, and it made his chest feel tight. She had given up so much for him over the years. The last thing he wanted was to disappoint her or make her life harder. But he also couldn't explain why regular school felt impossible for him. How could he tell the judge that he had already taught himself most of what his high school was supposed to teach him? That sitting through algebra class when he was working on calculus problems in his spare time felt like being forced to crawl when he wanted to run? "Your generation thinks everything should be easy," Judge Williams continued, warming up to her lecture. You think you can just skip the hard parts and somehow end up successful anyway. Well, let me tell you something, young man. Life doesn't work that way. Mr. Peterson, the public defender, tried to jump in. Your Honor, if I could just explain some of the circumstances. But the judge held up her hand to stop him. She wasn't done making her point. No, I want him to hear this, she said, pointing at David. Because apparently no one else has been willing to tell him the truth about where his choices are leading him. David was staring at his shoes again, but he was listening to every word. Each criticism felt like a punch to his stomach. Not because the judge was being mean exactly, but because she was so completely wrong about who he was and what he cared about. You're 17 years old, the judge said, her voice filled with frustration. In 1 year, you'll be an adult. You'll be out in the real world, trying to find a job, trying to make something of yourself. And what are you going to have to show for your life? A bunch of missed school days and excuses about how hard everything is? She paused, looking at David as if she expected him to finally say something. But he remained silent, holding on to his notebook like it was the only solid thing in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control. I've been doing this job for over 20 years, Judge Williams continued. I've seen thousands of kids come through this courtroom. And let me tell you, the ones who end up succeeding in life are the ones who understand that success requires showing up. Even when it's boring, even when it's hard, even when you don't feel like it. David knew she was trying to help him in her own way, but her words felt like they were about some other person, not him. She was talking about laziness and giving up, but that wasn't his story at all. He had never given up on learning. He just couldn't figure out how to make the regular school system work for him. The judge looked down at her papers again, then back at David. Your school reports say you're not failing your classes, which I suppose is something. But barely passing isn't enough anymore. The world is competitive now. You need to excel, not just get by. What she didn't know was that David wasn't barely passing. When he did show up for tests, he scored perfectly on almost everything. His teachers had noted this in his file, but it was buried under all the attendance problems and hadn't made it into the summary that the court received. I'm going to give you a choice, Judge Williams said, her tone becoming more official. You can continue on this path of skipping school and making excuses, and end up back in front of me in a few months facing much more serious consequences. Or you can start taking your life seriously and prove that you're better than your current behavior suggests. David finally looked up and met her eyes for a longer moment this time. The judge saw something there, not defiance, but something she couldn't quite identify. It might have been intelligence or sadness or fear, but she was too focused on teaching him a lesson to really consider what it might mean. I'm assigning you 40 hours of community service, she announced. You'll spend your weekends doing work that benefits the community instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself. Maybe spending your free time picking up litter and cleaning public spaces will help you understand the value of education. David nodded slightly to show he understood. The community service didn't worry him too much. At least it would be something different, something that might teach him new things. And you will return to school immediately, the judge continued. No more missed days without a medical excuse. If you're not sick enough to be in the hospital, you're healthy enough to be in class. As the judge finished explaining the terms of David's sentence, she felt satisfied that she had gotten through to him. In her experience, a firm hand and some hard truths were exactly what kids like this needed to turn their lives around. But she had no idea that sitting quietly in front of her was one of the most brilliant young minds she would ever encounter. The Metro Science Museum wasn't where David had expected to do his community service, but he wasn't complaining. When the community service coordinator told him he'd be cleaning and organizing exhibits instead of picking up trash on the highway, he felt a little spark of hope for the first time in weeks. The museum was quiet on Saturday mornings before it opened to the public. David arrived early, just as the security guard unlocked the front doors. The coordinator, Mrs. Rodriguez, showed him around and explained his duties, dusting display cases, organizing educational materials, and helping set up interactive exhibits. Just don't touch anything expensive, she warned him with a tired smile. And if you break something, tell me right away so we can figure out how to fix it. David nodded and got to work. The first area he was assigned was the physics section, which housed exhibits about everything from simple machines to quantum mechanics. As he wiped down the glass cases and organized scattered pamphlets, he couldn't help but read some of the information displays. Most of it was basic stuff he had learned years ago from library books. But some of the more advanced exhibits caught his attention, especially one about wave-particle duality that attempted to explain how light could behave as both a wave and a particle depending on how you observed it. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been the head of physics education at the museum for 8 years. She usually didn't come in on Saturday mornings, but she was working on a new exhibit about renewable energy and wanted to finish setting it up before the Monday school groups arrived. As she walked through the physics section carrying a box of solar panel models, she noticed the teenager who was supposed to be doing community service. Instead of just cleaning, he was standing in front of the quantum mechanics display, reading intently. At first, she didn't think much of it. Lots of kids found the science exhibits interesting, even if they didn't really understand them. But something about the way David was studying the information made her curious. He wasn't just glancing at it like most visitors did. He was really concentrating, like he was trying to work something out in his head. Dr. Martinez set down her box and watched him for a few minutes. David had pulled out that battered notebook he always carried and was writing something down. She could see his lips moving slightly, like he was talking to himself about what he was reading. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her, and she walked over. "Interesting exhibit, isn't it?" she said gently, not wanting to startle him. David looked up, surprised. He had been so focused on the display that he hadn't noticed anyone approaching. For a moment, he looked like he might just mumble something polite and go back to his cleaning. But then something about Dr. Martinez's friendly expression made him feel like maybe it was safe to actually say what he was thinking. "The equation here," he said quietly, pointing to a complex mathematical formula that was part of the exhibit. "I think there's an error in the third term." Dr. Martinez looked at the equation more closely. She had helped design this exhibit herself, working with several physics professors to make sure all the information was accurate. She was pretty sure it was correct, but David seemed so certain that she decided to take a closer look. "What kind of error do you think it is?" she asked, pulling out her own notebook. David hesitated for a moment, then pointed to a specific part of the equation. "This part here assumes that the wave function collapses instantaneously, but that's not actually what happens. There should be a time-dependent term that accounts for the measurement process itself." Dr. Martinez stared at him. What he was saying was not only correct, but it was an extremely subtle point that most undergraduate physics students wouldn't catch. She had actually noticed the same issue when they were designing the exhibit, but they had decided to simplify it for a general audience. "You're absolutely right," she said, looking at David with new interest. "How did you know that?" David shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I read about it online. There was this research paper about quantum measurement theory, and it explained how the measurement process itself takes time and affects the results." Dr. Martinez was amazed. The research he was referring to was cutting-edge work that had only been published in the past couple of years. It wasn't the kind of thing that typical high school students would even know existed, let alone understand well enough to spot errors in simplified explanations. "Can I see your notebook?" she asked gently. David hesitated. He had never shown his work to any adult before, except for his grandmother, who couldn't really understand it but always encouraged him anyway. But something about Dr. Martinez made him feel like she might actually be able to appreciate what he had been working on. Slowly, he handed over the worn composition book. Dr. Martinez opened it carefully and began to read. What she found inside made her catch her breath. Page after page of advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, and original ideas that were far beyond anything she would have expected from a teenager. There were proofs of mathematical theorems she recognized from graduate school. There were diagrams explaining complex scientific concepts with a clarity that many textbooks couldn't match. There were even some original theories that looked like they might actually be worth investigating. "David," she said, looking up from the notebook with amazement in her voice, "where did you learn all of this?" For the first time in months, David felt like an adult was actually interested in hearing what he had to say, instead of just lecturing him about what he was doing wrong. "Mostly from the library," he explained. "They have computers there and I can access research databases and online courses. I've been teaching myself calculus and physics and chemistry. Sometimes I find mistakes in my reasoning and have to start over, but usually I can figure things out if I work at it long enough." Dr. Martinez flipped through more pages of the notebook, becoming more impressed with each one. "David, this work is extraordinary. Some of these proofs are at the level of advanced undergraduate or even graduate work. How long have you been studying these subjects? David thought about it. I guess seriously for about 3 years. But I've always been interested in how things work. When I was little, I used to take apart broken appliances to see what was inside them. And you've been doing all of this on your own, without any teachers or tutors? David nodded. My grandmother tries to help, but she didn't get to finish high school herself. She always tells me she's proud of me for studying, but she doesn't really understand what I'm working on. Dr. Martinez was beginning to understand why David had been having trouble at school. If he was capable of this level of work, regular high school classes must have felt painfully slow and basic to him. David, can I ask you something? Why haven't you been going to school regularly? David looked down at his feet, suddenly feeling ashamed again. It's hard to explain. The classes move really slowly, and I already know most of what they're teaching. But I can't just skip ahead because they have rules about what grade you're supposed to be in. So I sit there feeling like I'm wasting time when I could be learning new things. Have you tried talking to your teachers about this? David shook his head. I tried once in freshman year. But when I told my algebra teacher I'd already learned calculus, she thought I was lying or trying to show off. She gave me extra homework as punishment for being disrespectful. After that, I figured it was better to just stay quiet and do the work, even if it was boring. Dr. Martinez felt a surge of sadness and anger. Here was an incredibly gifted young person who had been essentially ignored by the educational system, left to educate himself and then punished for not fitting into the standard mold. David, I think I need to make some phone calls about your situation. What you've accomplished here is remarkable, and there might be ways to get you into more appropriate educational programs. David looked up hopefully, but also a little scared. You mean like getting in trouble for not going to regular school? No, I mean like getting you into advanced programs where you can actually learn at your own pace and work with material that challenges you appropriately. For the first time since his court appearance, David smiled. Maybe there was hope that his life could change for the better. Dr. Martinez couldn't stop thinking about David over the weekend. She had spent Saturday night going through educational research about gifted students, trying to understand how someone with such obvious talent could have fallen through the cracks so completely. On Monday morning, she decided to call Lincoln High School to learn more about David's academic record. She expected to find a student who was failing most subjects, based on what she had heard about his truancy issues. What she discovered instead left her stunned. "Oh, David Thompson," said Mrs. Anderson, the school counselor, when Dr. Martinez explained why she was calling. "Yes, he's one of our more puzzling cases. Attendance is terrible, but when he does show up for tests, he scores perfectly on almost everything." "What do you mean by perfectly?" Dr. Martinez asked. "I mean 100%. Every time. Math tests, science tests, even subjects like history and English literature. His teachers say he finishes tests in about 10 minutes that are designed to take the full class period. Then he just sits there quietly until the bell rings." Dr. Martinez felt her excitement growing. "Have any of his teachers tried to give him more challenging material?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, that's complicated. We have policies about grade-appropriate curriculum, and David is registered as a regular junior. Most of his teachers assume he must be cheating somehow, because they can't understand how he could know material they haven't taught yet. Cheating how? Some think he has the answers written on his hands or hidden in his calculator. Others think maybe his grandmother is giving him the answers ahead of time. But we've never been able to prove anything, and he never causes any disruptions in class. He just sits quietly in the back and does whatever work we give him." Dr. Martinez realized the situation was even more tragic than she had thought. Not only was David being underserved by the educational system, but his teachers actually suspected him of dishonesty rather than recognizing his abilities. "Mrs. Anderson, I'd like to suggest something. What if David isn't cheating? What if he's genuinely that advanced academically?" "I suppose that's possible," the counselor said, though she didn't sound convinced. "But we'd need some way to verify that. And even if it were true, I'm not sure what we could do about it. We don't have programs for students who are that far ahead of their grade level." After hanging up with the school, Dr. Martinez made several more calls. She contacted colleagues at the local university, professors she had worked with on various education projects. She explained David's situation and asked if they would be willing to evaluate his work. Dr. James Wright, a mathematics professor, agreed to meet with David that Wednesday afternoon. Dr. Martinez had scanned some pages from David's notebook and sent them ahead, so Professor Wright had an idea of what to expect. "I have to admit, I'm curious," Professor Wright told Dr. Martinez over the phone. "The mathematical work you showed me is quite sophisticated. If a high school student really did this independently, it would be extraordinary." The meeting was arranged for Wednesday at 4 p.m. in Professor Wright's office at the university. David was nervous about missing more school, but Dr. Martinez had spoken with Mrs. Anderson and gotten permission for him to leave early for what she called an educational evaluation. David had never been on a university campus before. The buildings were bigger and more impressive than his high school, and everywhere he looked he saw students who seemed older and more serious about their studies. It made him feel both excited and intimidated. Professor Wright's office was cramped and filled with books from floor to ceiling. Mathematical equations covered every available bit of whiteboard space, and papers were scattered across every surface. It looked like the kind of place where serious thinking happened. "So you're David," Professor Wright said, shaking hands with him. "Dr. Martinez has told me some interesting things about your work. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right." For the next hour, Professor Wright put David through what felt like the most intense academic conversation of his life. The professor would write a complex equation on the whiteboard and ask David to explain what it meant. He would describe a theoretical problem and ask David to suggest approaches for solving it. To David's amazement, he found himself keeping up with the conversation and even contributing ideas that seemed to interest Professor Wright. Instead of feeling stupid or lost like he often did in regular classes, David felt like his mind was finally being stretched and challenged in ways that felt good. "Remarkable," Professor Wright said finally, sitting back in his chair. "David, the level of mathematical understanding you've demonstrated today is typically seen in students who are finishing their undergraduate degrees. Some of the insights you've shared are at the graduate level." David wasn't sure what to say. "Does that mean I'm not as behind as I thought I was?" Professor Wright laughed. "Behind? David, you're not behind at all. You're years ahead of where most students your age would be, even students who are considered academically gifted." Over the next few days, Dr. Martinez arranged for David to meet with other professors. A chemistry professor tested his understanding of molecular structures and chemical reactions. A physics professor discussed advanced concepts in relativity and quantum mechanics. An English professor was amazed by David's ability to analyze complex literature and write about it with sophistication and insight. Each professor reached the same conclusion. David was operating at a level far beyond typical high school work, and in some areas, beyond typical college work as well. Dr. Martinez also did some research into David's background. She learned about the car accident that had killed his parents, about his grandmother's struggles to provide for them both, about the financial stress that had prevented David from getting the kind of educational support he needed. She discovered that David had actually scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests throughout elementary school, but that these scores had been largely ignored because his family didn't have the resources or knowledge to advocate for special programs. The more she learned, the more determined Dr. Martinez became to help David get the educational opportunities he deserved. But she also realized that the biggest obstacle might be the very system that had failed him in the first place. She decided that the best approach would be to go back to the source of David's current legal troubles, Judge Williams. If she could convince the judge that David wasn't a troublemaker, but rather a gifted student who had been failed by the system, maybe she could help change his trajectory completely. Dr. Martinez spent several evenings preparing her case. She gathered letters of recommendation from the professors who had evaluated David. She compiled examples of his mathematical and scientific work, along with expert explanations of why it was so impressive. She researched successful programs for highly gifted students and prepared proposals for how David's education could be restructured to better serve his needs. Finally, she called the courthouse and requested a meeting with Judge Williams. She explained that she had information about David Thompson that she believed was crucial to his case and his future. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Dr. Martinez spent the weekend going over her materials one more time, hoping she could find the right words to help the judge understand that the quiet young man who had appeared before her wasn't at all who she thought he was. David, meanwhile, continued going to school and doing his community service, not knowing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. Judge Williams was running late on Monday morning, having spent the weekend dealing with a family emergency, when her assistant handed her a note saying that a Dr. Martinez from the Science Museum was waiting to discuss the David Thompson case. She almost canceled the meeting. She had a full docket of cases that day and couldn't afford to fall behind schedule. But something about the urgency in her assistant's voice made her reconsider. She says she has important information about the boy's educational background that could affect his sentencing, her assistant explained. Judge Williams sighed and told her to send Dr. Martinez in. She expected this to be another well-meaning adult making excuses for a troubled teenager. In her experience, there was always someone ready to blame the system instead of holding kids accountable for their choices. Dr. Martinez entered the judge's chambers carrying a thick folder. She was nervous but determined. Everything she had learned about David over the past week had convinced her that this young man deserved a chance to prove what he was really capable of. Your Honor, thank you for taking the time to see me, Dr. Martinez began. I've been working with David Thompson during his community service at our museum, and I've discovered some things about him that I believe you need to know. Judge Williams gestured for her to sit down. Dr. Martinez, I appreciate your concern for this young man, but I've been doing this job long enough to know that community service coordinators often develop soft spots for the kids they're trying to help. Just because he's been polite and cooperative with you doesn't mean he's learned his lesson about skipping school. That's not why I'm here, Dr. Martinez said firmly. She opened her folder and pulled out several documents. I'm here because David isn't what any of us thought he was when he appeared in your courtroom. She handed Judge Williams a letter from Professor Wright. This is from a mathematics professor at the university. He evaluated David's work and found it to be at the level of an advanced undergraduate, possibly graduate student. Judge Williams took the letter, but didn't read it immediately. Dr. Martinez, I'm sure David is a bright young man, but that doesn't excuse— Please, Dr. Martinez interrupted gently. Just read it. Then look at this. She handed over copies of pages from David's notebook, along with expert explanations of what the work represented. These are mathematical proofs that David developed entirely on his own. The concepts he's working with are taught in advanced calculus and theoretical physics courses. Finally, Judge Williams began to read. As she worked through the documents, her expression slowly changed from skepticism to confusion to amazement. The mathematical work was completely beyond her understanding, but the letters from university professors were clear. This wasn't typical high school level thinking. I don't understand, Judge Williams said finally. If David is capable of this level of work, why is he failing in school? He's not failing, Dr. Martinez replied. I spoke with his school counselor. When David actually shows up for tests, he scores perfect marks on everything. His teachers think he must be cheating because they can't understand how he knows material they haven't taught yet. Judge Williams sat down the papers and looked directly at Dr. Martinez. Are you telling me that this young man has been teaching himself college-level material while skipping high school classes? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And there's more. Dr. Martinez explained about David's background, the death of his parents, his grandmother's financial struggles, the complete lack of educational support for his exceptional abilities. She talked about how David had been essentially ignored by the educational system, despite scoring in the 99th percentile on standardized tests throughout elementary school. Your Honor, David hasn't been skipping school because he doesn't care about education. He's been skipping school because the education he's receiving there is completely inadequate for someone of his abilities. Imagine being forced to sit through classes that move at a pace that's painfully slow for you, learning material you mastered years ago. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was hearing. She thought back to her harsh words in the courtroom, her assumptions about David's character and motivations. She remembered his silence, which she had interpreted as disrespect, but now understood might have been shyness or frustration. Dr. Martinez, if what you're saying is true, then I've done this young man a serious disservice. The good news is that it's not too late to change course, Dr. Martinez said. I've been researching programs for highly gifted students. There are options that would allow David to accelerate his education, take college courses while finishing high school requirements, and get the intellectual challenge he needs. She handed Judge Williams another set of documents outlining potential educational paths for David, including scholarship opportunities and special programs designed for exceptional students. Judge Williams spent the next 20 minutes reading through everything Dr. Martinez had brought. The more she read, the more she realized how completely she had misjudged the situation. "I need to see David again," she said finally. "Can you arrange for him to come to court this afternoon?" "Of course. But, Your Honor, please remember that David has severe social anxiety, especially in formal settings like courtrooms. His silence isn't disrespect, he's just overwhelmed by situations where he feels like he's being judged." That afternoon, David sat in the same chair where he had been lectured weeks earlier. This time, though, Judge Williams looked at him with completely different eyes. She saw not a defiant teenager, but a shy young man who had been carrying the weight of exceptional abilities without any support or recognition. "David," Judge Williams began, and then did something unusual. She stood up from behind her bench and came around to speak with him at eye level. "I owe you an apology." David looked up, surprised. In all his interactions with authority figures, no adult had ever apologized to him before. "I made assumptions about you that were not only wrong but harmful," the judge continued. "I thought your silence meant you didn't respect education, when actually you respect it so much that you've been educating yourself far beyond what most people your age could handle." David didn't know what to say. He looked back toward his grandmother, who had tears in her eyes. She had always known her grandson was special, but she had never been able to convince anyone else to see it. "Dr. Martinez has shown me some of your work, Judgy," Williams said. "I don't understand the mathematics, but I understand what it represents. You have extraordinary gifts, David, and instead of nurturing those gifts, our system has been punishing you for having them." The judge explained about the programs Dr. Martinez had found, the scholarship opportunities, the chance for David to take college courses while completing his high school diploma. She talked about connecting him with mentors who could help guide his education and development. "But first," she said, "I'm dismissing all charges against you. You're not a delinquent, David. You're a brilliant young man who deserves every opportunity to reach your potential." 6 months later, David stood at a podium in the same courthouse where he had once been lectured and humiliated. But this time he was there as a speaker at a conference about educational reform and gifted student advocacy. Judge Williams had become one of the strongest supporters of programs to identify and nurture exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds. She often spoke about the day she learned that the quiet teenager she had dismissed as a troublemaker was actually one of the most gifted young minds she would ever encounter. Sometimes, David told the audience of educators, social workers, and juvenile justice professionals, "Being quiet doesn't mean you have nothing to say. Sometimes it means you have so much to say that you don't know how to find the words." In the audience, his grandmother beamed with pride. Dr. Martinez smiled from the front row, and Judge Williams, who had introduced him, felt a deep satisfaction knowing that she had been able to help change a young person's life trajectory simply by being willing to admit she had been wrong and look deeper than her initial assumptions. David was now enrolled in a special program that allowed him to take graduate-level courses at the university while finishing his high school requirements. He had been awarded a full scholarship for his future college education and was working with professors on research that might someday contribute to important scientific breakthroughs. But, perhaps most importantly, he had found his voice. The shy teenager who had once sat silently while being lectured about his supposed failures was now confidently sharing his story, hoping to help other gifted students who might be struggling in systems that weren't designed to recognize their potential. The courthouse that had once felt like a place of judgment and shame had become a symbol of second chances and the power of looking beyond surface appearances to see the truth about who people really are.